Once there was an anthropologist. For his PhD, this man had a dissertation to write. So he searched out a group of people to find out about. He wanted to know the truth. So he turned on his tape recorder and asked, "Oh, who is your father? Who is your mother? Who is your sister, your uncle, your brother? Whom can you marry? Whom can you bury? What do you call your mother-in-law?"
The way that I think of heritage as a mode of cultural production is that one of its key qualities is it brings a certain awareness and value to a cultural practice that might otherwise have been taken for granted and treated as part of the everyday fabric of normal life. Once the process of making something into heritage takes place, it can continue in that way indefinitely, or it's entirely possible that it could become a taken for granted part of everyday life. I think of weddings as a good context to explore this idea. You may have wedding practices that are just treated as customs, as customary practices. There may come a period where they fall into disuse. They may then be picked up again and very self-consciously treated as, quote, heritage, but then they may become so habituated as to again become customary. So I think of it not as going back, but as the second life having actually a third life as, if you will, custom as opposed to heritage. That just to find some kind of language to distinguish between a customary practice and a heritage practice.
You developed Paulina Museum is a counterpoint to what heritage could be, not place with that divide between tangible and intangible.
In the case of Paulina Museum, the intention was to create a museum of the history of Polish Jews. And so much of that history, which spans approximately 1,000 years, is without any tangible remains, no tangible traces, particularly the first 500 years of that millennium. And so our first concern was how to tell a really epic story in a compelling way using exhibition as our medium. That's point number one. Point number two was to try to recover not only that history, but also the memory of it, and to transmit what we think of as the legacy of the civilization that Polish Jews created to future generations. And what made that project so urgent was the Holocaust and the genocide of 90% of the Jewish population of Poland during the Second World War, and the destruction of the world they created with them. And so the idea to recapture this history and to recapture the civilization that Polish Jews created, and to do so at this time and in Poland and on that spot, that was really our goal. Once embarked on that project, the question was, what were we going to work with? We had very little that you would call tangible culture to work with, or tangible heritage to work with. Very little in terms of actual objects, particularly very few original objects in our own collection. Some things we had on loan, other things we had to copy, make a facsimile or a replica, although we're trying to replace those with original objects from our own collection. But what we did have was a wealth of what you would call intangible heritage, intangible culture. Let's start with that. Let's call it intangible culture, but it has added value. So whether it's rabbinical correspondence, letters, memoirs, autobiographies, chronicles, legal documents, contracts, statutes, whatever it might be, and that, I mean, it's tangible in the sense that they're texts or manuscripts, but what we valued was not the physical object, the material it was made out of. We valued the content of what was in it. whether it was whatever form it took. And so that was really, those were really our, you could call them, those were our artifacts. Our artifacts were intangible. And we worked with them in several ways. We first of all built our storytelling from them, and we also built our, what I would call, play script from them. So there were two ways in which, there are many ways, but two primary ways in which one could think of this exhibition as a theater of history. The first is scenographic. This is, you could call this theater of mise en scène. You could call it still life theater. You could call it scenographic theater. And it's in the tradition of diorama, panorama. It's in that, and I would say it's basically in that tradition, which is actually has a very long history. It's nothing new. It has a history, goes back at least to the 18th century, if not earlier, if one thinks about mise en scène. So that was the first, is that it was scenographic and a narration through scenography. Linked to that is the principle of narrative space, and that is that the organization and the, I would say, the treatment of space is itself a narrator, is a narrating instrument. So it's narrative space, it's a kind of scenographic approach, but the third is the way in which we did the narrating, and we tried to narrate using quotations from primary sources from the period. And what that did was to produce a kind of play script.
Exactly.
In essence, yes, a kind of play script. And the intention was that our visitors should, metaphorically speaking, hear the voices of the period and feel close to those whose story we're telling. And so the story is really composed, because all exhibitions are composed of fragments. Fragments of text, fragments, whether they're objects, whatever they might be, but there is a kind of inherent discontinuity or intermittency in the very nature of exhibitions. I mean, except for panoramas that are a continuous band, so to speak, all exhibitions are made up of pieces. And the pieces either, it depends on how they're composed, how they're curated, how they're juxtaposed, how they're selected, how they're sequenced. But in essence, that is the essence of exhibitions. And so between narrative space, scenographic approach, and this, what I call play script of texts that are taken from documents from the period and quoted, those are the building blocks for creating this theater of history. And the beauty of this theater of history is that, and this I think is a defining feature of exhibitions, is that the theater itself is still, but it's the visitor that moves. Whereas we think of theater as moving and there's the viewer as stationary. Yes. And this is it just turns it on its head. It's the exact opposite. And so the visitor is what makes the story move, because only as the visitor moves does the plot unfold. And so it's the visitor's movement through space that actually is the, if you will, starts the engine of the narration going. And what's very interesting for me, particularly in the way that we created the exhibition, is that we created it so that the horizon forward is very shallow. In other words, it's no further than people at the time could see. So if you were living in 1560, how far forward could you see? To 1562, 1570, but you're not going to see all the way to 1900. And so we wanted our visitors to be moving forward with a very shallow, I would say, time frame beyond the moment that they're in.
Yeah, I will have a question to address specifically.
And what's very important is that never gets deeper, but the past gets deeper and deeper as they move forward. The future is never far away, and the past gets deeper and deeper. So that is a very specific kind of experience. And I think it's very specific to exhibition, and particularly to the exhibition at Paulina Museum.
Temporality is one of the principal topics of critical heritage now. There is 26 panels of the European EASA conference in Lisbon that mentioned the word future. The next critical heritage studies conference is all focused on time. And I find these both concepts of meta-history and your application of time in the heritage experience very, very intense.
The issue of time is enormously important, as you've rightly noted. And one of the reasons that we took this approach was to, I would say, fight with the teleology of the Holocaust.
Okay.
This was for us absolutely critical. And that is that the Holocaust, as an absolutely catastrophic event, has understandably come to define this 1,000-year history of Polish Jews, as if with the first massacre or tumult in the Middle Ages, we had the beginning of a steady march of anti-Jewish violence and anti-Semitism that began with hate and ends with genocide. And that line is something we wanted to break. And it was very important for us that visitors who invariably identify Poland, Jews, and Holocaust, that they bracket what they know about what came later, and that they not view this 1,000-year history through the lens of the Holocaust by backshadowing, or as they're walking through this 1,000-year story, be foreshadowing the Holocaust, expecting it to come, and thinking and connecting events along the way to it and constructing a kind of teleological narrative. So how to break that? How to somehow help our visitors to think differently? That was for us critically important. And it was also important for us to try to decenter the Holocaust from the ways in which I would say our visitors have come to think, or generally, the view of this 1,000-year history is somehow or other inevitably leading to genocide. And so it was with that in mind that the idea of time became extremely important, and how to control the temporality of the way that we narrated, and how we could situate our visitors within the time of the story, and to avoid the feeling of causality that somehow or other hate is the dominant thread that runs through the history of Polish Jews. Because this is, well, there's a very famous historian, Salo Baron, a Polish Jew who came to America, and a magisterial historian. And he fought against what he called lachrymose history, a history of piety, poverty, and persecution, which he said had dominated 19th century Jewish historians of the Jews during the 19th century. They very often followed this, I would say, paradigm of piety, persecution, and poverty. And he said, that is not the history. That is not the history of the Jews. And we would argue it's not the history of Polish Jews either.
So dignity became like
well, actually, put it this way. I'll put it differently. I would say that in Poland, until recently, and even now, but not to the same degree, the dominant paradigm in the history of Polish Jews is a history of Polish-Jewish relations. And a history of Polish-Jewish relations is actually more about Poles than it is about Jews, because it's almost invariably about anti-Semitism or assimilation. So, and it's understandable, because these historians, at least until recently, were basically working with Polish archives, Polish sources, and with issues that really were of burning interest and concern to Polish scholars and to their readers. Our approach was to offer a history of Polish Jews in which Jews are agents in their own history, and not objects on which others project their fantasies and fears. This was for us critical. And when Jews are agents in their own history, then their ultimate fate is not as victims of history, and cannot be a history of victimhood. It doesn't necessarily make them heroes, but it makes them normal people, and that have a range of experiences, but who have agency. And so a history of Polish Jews meant really that for me is one of the gifts of the exhibition, and one of the gifts of the museum is to offer an alternative to a history of Polish-Jewish relations. It doesn't mean that in other words, I would say that this is a history that is relational without being a history of Polish-Jewish relations. There's a whole spectrum of relations.
It contrasts with the Jewish Museum. It creates a huge contrast with in Berlin. I don't know if you visited.
Oh, sure, of course.
It has that victimhood sense.
Well, to some degree, you know, they're opening a brand new permanent exhibition in May. So it's going to be interesting to see what it is. I think that what you're capturing with regard to the Jewish Museum Berlin is perhaps communicated through the architecture, which is very much references the Holocaust. And no matter what goes inside, that architecture is a very, very strong statement. And it is definitely communicates Holocaust as a central frame for that history. And that history, of course, is a much richer and much more complicated history. And I do believe that in their new permanent exhibition, they will work with the building in a way that will give them more control over the way in which the narrative sits within essentially a Holocaust shell, is how I put it. I actually think it's an incredible building. I just don't think it's the right building for that story and for that museum. Although I think it's, as architecture, it's fantastic. But going back to your question about time, what's interesting about time is that is the way in which we do or don't work with retrospect.
Okay.
And that's interesting. Retrospect's okay as long as it's inside the period, but not if it's outside the period. And there are two places where that is where it's interesting to look. So one is the Holocaust, because we do not use post-Holocaust survivor testimony in the Holocaust gallery. There are no video testimonies of Holocaust survivors that were made in the 1960s or 70s or 80s. Not at all. And if there's any post-war material, it'll be from immediately after the war. But basically, all the material is from the wartime, and it's all what we call in real-time sources, not post facto. But the 19th century, one of our key narrators, so to speak, is a woman by the name of Paulina Wengeroff, who lived a long time. She really lived through most of the century. And just before World War I, she published her memoirs, and she was already in her 80s. And the beauty of her memoir is that it was written in the period, about the period, by somebody who had experienced all the changes that we were interested in showing in the 19th century. So we call the 19th century Encounters with Modernity. And we're interested in all the kinds of challenges of modernity, which we can define, all the challenges and the variety of ways that Jews responded to them. And the beauty of her memoir is not only that she describes those changes, but what she communicates is the consciousness of change. That is for us the primary value. So in other words, in a sense, retrospect is kind of weaponized I would say, for its value in communicating not just the changes, but the awareness or the consciousness of change. And that's its value for us. So it's not just a kind of a substitute for other sources that are in real time. It has the additional value of the kind of historical awareness that it brings from inside the period, not from 85 years after the end of the events that are being recounted. So I think that those would be two really quite interesting example. And then the third, which I think is also interesting, would be let's call it the temporality of the wooden synagogue reconstruction. Now, I usually don't use the word reconstruction. I don't call it a facsimile, a copy, a replica, a reconstruction, a restoration. I don't use any of that language. And the reason I don't use that language is that I consider the Gwoździec's wooden synagogue roof, timber-framed roof and ceiling, I actually consider it a new kind of object. In other words, when you're in Japan and you go to a wooden shrine, you don't say that it's a replica, a recreation, a reconstruction, a facsimile, or a copy. It is the shrine. It simply is the shrine. And it is, quote, 800 years old and never older than 20 years. Ours is not exactly, ours is not the same situation as those shrines, but it's also not a copy of something. It is actually a new kind of object whose value lies in the knowledge that was recovered by building it using traditional tools, materials, and techniques. That's the key.
But in fact, when you are dealing with that materials, they are containers of stories, and they have an agency.
There are a couple of different issues. One issue has to do with original objects, original artifacts. Our visitors, I don't know whether this is true across the board, but in Poland, our visitors, they expect and they love to see original historical objects, and really wonderful ones. Very old, very rare, very important, very beautiful. This is for them critically important, and some visitors are disappointed when they don't see what they expect are more original objects. On the other hand, I'm often disappointed that when we do show original objects, they walk right by, but that's another story. So the question is, what is it about these original objects that is so appealing? And I think there's a variety of things. I think that coming into contact with a material trace of the past and the sense that it is somehow very connected in a material way has a certain emotional power, and how do we use objects? Maybe let's start there. How do we use objects? Whether they're original, facsimiles, copies, whatever it might be, we use them to support the story. So we don't start from a collection and ask, how can we tell a story through our collection? We ask, how can these objects, or which objects can support the story? And they can support the story in many different ways. And very often, their support is emotional. And it might be sensory, or it might be, I would say, kind of a spark to the imagination or to curiosity. So it's not necessarily didactic. It's not necessarily that the object adds information, but it might add visual interest, or it might add surprise, or it might add a kind of aesthetic pleasure. There's a whole range of ways in which these objects can function. So the question is, do they have to be original objects? Can they be copies? Can they be facsimiles? Can they be replicas? And my feeling is that the added value of an original object is the perception, the understanding, the appreciation that it somehow or other, that it is a survivor, that it survived the past. Everything else vanished, but somehow it survived. And so the material trace is a survivor. And I think there's an appreciation of precisely that. And no copy can deliver that quality.
Yesterday, and in the text, you place an emphasis on
the stories.
How the actually making. There's an agency of the materials and the drawings.
Yes, yes.
On the recovering of the know-how, and I found that extraordinary. Because it's not theoretical. You made it.
Yes, actually, it's you put it in a very nice way. You know, I like Diana Taylor's idea of the body as an archive. And I believe that the way that we made and I say made, not remade, but the way that we made the Gvozdziec wooden synagogue roof and ceiling was, in a sense, to also make the body an archive. A body that was not yet an archive, to make it an archive, and by working with all this documentation, photographs, drawings, color studies, observation of other wooden structures that are from the same period, related techniques. And so what we did was, using all of that, plus traditional tools, traditional techniques, traditional materials, by that kind of process, we, in a sense, not only recovered the knowledge, but also embodied it, so that the body then became an archive of that knowledge, And in order to do so, in the process of doing so, we actually materialize that knowledge, and bingo, we have the wooden synagogue ceiling and roof. So that, on the one hand, yes, we wanted to have a wooden synagogue ceiling and roof, and we could have gone to a theater prop maker and said, here are the drawings, make us one. But we didn't start from there. We actually started from recovering the knowledge, and the materialization that was a requirement for recovering that knowledge then became this incredible object that's in the exhibition. And that gives it its uniqueness, and that's why it's a new kind of object. It's an actual object, not a virtual one, not a copy, not a substitute. It's a new kind of object.
Diana Taylor interviewed you once, and you said that performances can be a source of theory, not only a site for the use of theory. What advice would you give for a methodological, performative approach for researching, conceptualizing, and for more on-the-ground applications of intangible cultural heritage?
I believed in the importance of this project, and I wanted to bring everything I ever knew and ever did to bear to make this museum the best museum possible. But what I learned from doing it was astonishing. And I would say that it was from the process of creating the exhibition that I developed for myself new theoretical insights. And so it was during the work on it, it wasn't simply that all of the theoretical insights were prior to the project. Of course there were, ways of thinking that I brought to the project, but I would say, for example, that the creating of the wooden synagogue, of the ceiling and the roof.
Extraordinary example of
it's an incredible example where the sort of the theoretical richness that arose out of the process and out of thinking about that process, I don't think I would ever have come up with it under other circumstances. I mean, maybe if I had sat down and really confronted the Japanese shrines, but you know what, it's not the same thing. The Japanese shrines, there's a self-conscious understanding that the value is in the knowledge, and that to transmit the knowledge, which is embodied knowledge, you actually have to build it. And there are people who know how to do it, and they teach other people how to do it. It's not the same thing as this situation, because that is a straight transmission of knowledge, and ours was a recovery. And they're related, but they are different. So I would say it is probably the single best example, but also thinking about exhibition as theater. I had already been thinking about it as theater and teaching a graduate seminar on museum theater, but in creating this exhibition, that thinking, and theoretically speaking, really developed, and it developed out of the process.
How could we move some knowledge of the conception of live art, for instance, to the field of intangible cultural heritage? How can we mark those cultural performances without being a playground for tourism?
Well, actually, there are many of these cultural practices that without tourism, they would have absolutely no chance of surviving. They have lost the audiences, not even the audiences, they've lost the communities that once sustained them, and their only possibility for surviving, meaning having an audience and having the economic basis for survival, is in fact tourism. And the question is, what can we do with regard to tourism so that there is a kind of culturally sensitive tourism that can support these practices without debasing, trivializing, and in a sense evacuating them of their power, their meaning, and such. It's a really good question, and I don't have an answer.
I was concerned with that yesterday during the conference, because I study process in Portugal related to the ritual practice, and they rely on tourism, etc. What about Nadia Seramatakis?
Yeah.
What about the antiphony of the narrative of the performance and the representation of the intangible heritage?
Oh, that's a tough question. That is a tough question. So, tell me, when you say the antiphony...
Antiphony, I'm quoting the creation of a symphony by opposing voices. It could be synonymous of antagonism, reciprocity, face-to-face. Antiphony is also literally aesthetic and dramaturgic device.
Yes.
That's why I find
yes,
it
yes,
also
yes.
very
We actually work with, I didn't use that language, but we work with that principle. And by having more than one voice at a time. So in some cases, in that one wall that I showed, the Paradisus Judaeorum wall, I can't remember how many voices are on that wall, and that is the most antiphonal place in the whole exhibition. But sometimes it's only two, and they are juxtaposed. For example, in the Holocaust Gallery in the Warsaw Ghetto section, that you have the head of the Judenrat, the Jewish council that the Germans created, and then you have the head of the Underground Archive. One is writing in Polish, one is writing in Yiddish, one is writing in as an official that's responsible for trying to ameliorate these terrible conditions, and the other is recording what's going on in secret. And their perspectives on the same event and their quotations are kind of like a contrapuntal sequence, and they follow you, and you follow them along a path until each one goes silent, because one commits suicide and the other one is shot on the rubble. And so but that's a very good description. I think that I thought of harmony and cacophony, but I think, and polyphony, but I think that antiphony is also a very nice way of thinking about this approach.
Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate your work. It's fantastic.
Yeah, this was really a very thoughtful interview, and I do appreciate your careful preparation.
Thank you very much.
And your tough questions.
You are used to them, I'm sure.
But thank you. Lovely.
You.
Okay.